On May 12, 1998, a brilliant Yale student named Liam O'Connell walked into the university's most secure library and vanished without a trace. For 15 agonizing years, his disappearance remained one of Connecticut's most haunting cold cases, a ghost story whispered through the ivy-covered halls of the elite institution. The official narrative was that a promising young man from a rough background had simply walked away from the pressures of a world he didn't belong to. But that was a lie. The truth was far more sinister, hidden in plain sight within the pages of his unfinished thesis. An unexpected discovery in a dusty file cabinet would finally change everything, revealing a conspiracy that reached the highest echelons of academia. How is it possible that the evidence of a murder remained buried for so long, protected by the very institution sworn to cultivate knowledge? Before we unpack how Liam's own meticulous research notes, a series of seemingly random numbers hidden in his footnotes, became the key to unlocking a secret society and exposing a killer, drop a comment below letting us know where you're watching from, and make sure you subscribe. Trust me, you won't want to miss the chain of events that this one forgotten folder set into motion. The story you are about to hear is a testament to the fact that history is not just written by the victors. Sometimes it is silenced by them. But secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of fighting their way to the surface, demanding to be heard. And Liam O'Connell's story had been silent for far too long, waiting for someone to finally listen. Liam O'Connell was the personification of the American dream. At 22, he was the pride of Bridgeport, a working-class kid who had defied the odds. The first in his family to even dream of college, he had earned a full scholarship to Yale through sheer intellectual force and relentless determination. He wasn't like the other students, the sons and daughters of legacy families who moved through the Gothic campus with an air of inherited confidence. Liam was quiet, intense, and driven by a profound sense of justice. His passion was history, not as a collection of dates and names, but as a tool to give a voice to the forgotten. He carried the weight of his family's sacrifices on his shoulders, his greatest fear not being failure, but letting down the people who had given him everything. The afternoon he disappeared was unremarkable, steeped in the quiet reverence of Yale's Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library. He was seen by a classmate in the Special Collections Wing, surrounded by brittle 19th-century railroad maps. He mentioned he was on the verge of a breakthrough, that he'd finally found the missing link for his senior thesis on the industrial barons of the Gilded Age. He left his backpack slung over his chair, a book lying open on the table, and his worn denim jacket resting beside it. It was the posture of someone who intended to be back in a few minutes. But he never returned. No one saw him leave the building. No one saw him walk off campus. In the heart of one of the world's most prestigious universities, Liam O'Connell simply ceased to exist. For his family back in Bridgeport, the hours that followed were a descent into a specific kind of hell reserved for the parents of a missing child. His mother, Sharon, spent the night calling every hospital and police precinct in the state, her voice growing hoarser and more desperate with each denial. His father, a stoic man who worked at the local factory, paced the small living room, the silence of the house amplifying his terror. They had entrusted their only son to an institution that was supposed to be a gateway to a better life, a fortress of safety and opportunity. The idea that he could just vanish from inside those hallowed walls was incomprehensible, a violation of the natural order of things. Their pride had morphed into pure, undiluted panic. In stark contrast, the official response was maddeningly slow, colored by a quiet, insidious prejudice. The university administration, steeped in bureaucratic procedure, initially suggested he had likely taken an impromptu trip with friends to blow off steam before finals. It was a common occurrence, they assured his frantic parents. The New Haven Police Department was even more dismissive. When they learned Liam was from Bridgeport, a city with a reputation for crime, their investigation immediately took on a different tone. They didn't see a missing Yale scholar. They saw a kid from Bridgeport who had probably gotten into trouble. It took them 3 critical days to treat his disappearance as a serious case, by which point any potential trail had gone cold. The initial investigation was a textbook example of confirmation bias. Detectives focused almost exclusively on Liam's life in Bridgeport, searching for drug debts, gambling problems, or shady connections that simply didn't exist. They were looking for a story that fit their narrative of a working-class kid in over his head. They conducted cursory interviews with his professors at Yale, who described him as a brilliant but solitary and intense student. Instead of seeing this as a clue pointing toward his obsessive academic work, the police interpreted it as a sign of a troubled young man prone to erratic behavior. The world he inhabited at Yale, the very world he was investigating for his thesis, was treated as an irrelevant backdrop to a crime they had already decided on. For the O'Connell family, the years that followed were a relentless cycle of hope and despair. The case quickly went cold, but the tips never entirely stopped. There were cruel hoaxes and heartbreaking false alarms. A supposed sighting at a bus station in Oregon, a rumor that he had abandoned his life to join a reclusive cult in the Southwest, a psychic's vision of him living under a new name in Canada. Each call, each letter, would send a jolt of adrenaline through Sharon, a flicker of belief that this time it would be different. And each time the lead would dissolve into nothing, leaving behind a deeper layer of scar tissue over a wound that could never heal. The world moved on, but the O'Connells were trapped in May of 1998. The ambiguous loss shattered the family from the inside out. Liam's father, unable to cope with the crushing uncertainty and his own feelings of helplessness, retreated into a silent, bitter world of alcoholism. The man who had worked double shifts to support his son's dream was now a ghost in his own home. Sharon, however, channeled her grief into a tireless, one-woman crusade. For over a decade, she became a familiar, tragic figure in the community, spending her weekends taping faded missing posters with her son's smiling face onto telephone poles and storefront windows. The dream of a Yale education, once a symbol of their greatest achievement, had become a cruel monument to their unending nightmare, a constant reminder of everything they had lost. 15 years passed. Liam O'Connell's case became a piece of campus folklore at Yale, a cautionary tale whispered to incoming freshmen. The world had changed dramatically. The internet had reshaped society, a new century had dawned, but in the cold case files of the New Haven Police Department, Liam was frozen in time, forever 22. In the summer of 2013, a young, ambitious history professor named Dr. Ben Carter was assigned a new office on campus. It had previously belonged to the recently retired Dr. Alistair Finch, a titan in the history department, and, coincidentally, one of the last professors to have served as an advisor on Liam O'Connell's unfinished thesis. The office was cluttered with the academic debris of a long career, waiting to be cleared out. Ben Carter felt more like a janitor than a history professor as he surveyed the chaotic office. Dr. Finch had left behind a lifetime of academic accumulation, teetering stacks of books, yellowed lecture notes, and boxes of unsorted research. It was a daunting task, one he put off for weeks. He knew the name Alistair Finch, of course. The man was a legend in Gilded Age studies, a figure whose reputation was as monolithic as the campus architecture. Ben had also heard the whispers about the O'Connell case, a ghost story that permeated the department, but he never made a direct connection between the two. To him, clearing the office was simply a bureaucratic hurdle before he could begin his own work, a tedious chore standing between him and his future at Yale. The room felt heavy with the past, but not in a way he yet understood. By the fall of 1999, just over a year after Liam vanished, the New Haven Police Department officially classified his case as inactive. With no body, no ransom note, and no credible witnesses, the investigation had reached a complete standstill. The prevailing theory among detectives remained unchanged. The, quote, kid from Bridgeport had likely met with foul play related to a life he'd left behind, or had simply buckled under pressure and run away. The university, for its part, quietly accepted this conclusion. The scandal had been a brief, uncomfortable disruption to its centuries-old prestige. With the media attention gone and the police investigation dormant, A collective sigh of relief seemed to emanate from the administration buildings. Liam O'Connell's name was relegated to a cold case file, a statistical anomaly in an institution that preferred to bury its imperfections. Sharon O'Connell refused to let the world forget. While the official investigation died, hers was just beginning. She spent her nights poring over Liam's high school yearbooks and rereading his letters from Yale, searching for any name or detail the police might have overlooked. She became her own detective, driven by a mother's intuition that the answer was not in Bridgeport, but within the stone walls of the university. She called the lead detective every Monday for 7 years, her voice a familiar, pleading presence, until he was promoted and his replacement stopped taking her calls altogether. She was dismissed as a grieving mother unable to accept reality, her persistence viewed not as dedication, but as delusion. For Sharon, every slammed door, every unreturned phone call, was another layer of injustice piled upon her unbearable loss. Liam's father, Mike, processed the loss in a tragically different way. The uncertainty was a poison that seeped into the foundations of his being. He couldn't mourn a son who might still be alive, and he couldn't hope without being ripped apart by disappointment. The stoic factory worker who had preached the value of hard work and perseverance was broken. He found his solace at the bottom of a bottle, the alcohol dulling the sharp edges of his ambiguous grief. Their home, once filled with proud conversations about Liam's future, fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. There were no fights, no dramatic blow-ups, just the quiet, devastating erosion of a marriage as two people grieved in separate, lonely worlds, trapped together in a house where every photograph on the wall was a monument to a shared, unending pain. Over the years, Liam O'Connell became two different ghosts. In Bridgeport, he was a fallen hero, a local boy who had made it to the top only to be cruelly struck down. His story was a cautionary tale, told with a mixture of pride and sorrow, a reminder of the invisible walls that still existed between their world and the world of the elite. At Yale, however, his memory was stripped of its humanity. He became a piece of campus lore, a spooky story told to scare freshmen about the dangers of wandering the stacks alone at night. His family's very real agony was transformed into a fictionalized narrative for the entertainment of privileged students. The faded posters Sharon tirelessly put up around New Haven were a physical manifestation of this divide, a mother's desperate cry for help in a city that had already turned her son into a myth. In 2006, a flicker of hope ignited, only to burn them more severely than ever before. News channels across the country reported that a John Doe, found wandering a highway in rural Oregon with profound amnesia, bore a striking resemblance to an age-progressed photo of Liam. For 3 days, the O'Connells were thrust back into the national spotlight. A television producer paid for Sharon's flight, and she traveled across the country, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She walked into a sterile hospital room, her hands trembling, and saw a man with kind, vacant eyes who looked vaguely like her son, but wasn't. The crushing weight of that moment, the public spectacle of her renewed grief, was almost more than she could bear. It was the cruelest kind of hope, the kind that leaves you emptier than you were before. Back in 2013, Ben Carter finally decided to tackle the last bastion of Dr. Finch's academic clutter, a heavy, 4-drawer metal filing cabinet tucked into a corner of the office. He worked his way through dusty folders of old syllabi and grant applications, his mind on his own upcoming lecture. Near the back of the bottom drawer, he found a thin manila folder with a simple, handwritten label, Drafts Incomplete. He pulled it out, expecting to find an abandoned paper from some long-forgotten graduate student. But the name typed on the cover page made him pause. Liam O'Connell. He felt a slight chill. He knew the name, of course. Everyone in the history department did. It was the legend. He almost put it back, but a historian's curiosity got the better of him. He sat down and began to read. The manuscript in his hands was more than just a draft. It was a work of staggering intellectual rigor. Ben Carter himself a published historian, recognized the signs of a truly gifted mind. Liam O'Connell's thesis, titled The Iron Veins of New England, was a masterful deconstruction of the Gilded Age railroad tycoons. The research was exhaustive, the arguments sharp and incisive. Liam had connected dots that generations of historians had missed. But as Ben read deeper, he noticed something peculiar. The footnotes were unconventional. They were meticulously formatted, but they contained an extra layer of information, a series of numbers after the standard citation that served no academic purpose he could discern. It was a small, nagging detail in an otherwise brilliant piece of scholarship, an anomaly that felt strangely deliberate. At first, Ben dismissed it as a personal organizational system, a quirk of a meticulous student. But the pattern was too consistent to be accidental. Following each source citation, there was a sequence of 3 numbers. For example, asterisk, author, title, page, 3, 7, 2. It appeared in dozens of footnotes throughout the 100-page document. No established citation style, not Chicago, not MLA, not anything, used such a format. It was extraneous data, and in a formal thesis, every mark on the page has a purpose. A creeping sense of unease began to settle over him. It felt less like a research paper and more like a puzzle. What was Liam trying to say? It was a silent question that hung in the stale air of the forgotten office, a ghost whispering from the pages. Driven by an impulse he couldn't explain, Ben stood up and scanned the dusty bookshelves that lined the office walls. He found one of the obscure historical texts Liam had cited. His heart began to beat a little faster as he located the exact book and turned to the page number from the footnote. He then followed the cryptic instructions. 3rd page, 7th paragraph, 2nd word. The word was Finch. A coincidence, he thought, his logical mind trying to dismiss the chill running down his spine. He grabbed another book, another citation. This time, the sequence was page 54, paragraph 2, word 9. He found the spot. The word was lies. At that moment, Ben Carter knew this was no longer an academic curiosity. He was holding a secret message, meticulously crafted by a young man just before he vanished from the face of the earth. For the next several hours, the world outside the small, cluttered office ceased to exist. Ben worked with a frantic, obsessive energy, pulling books from the shelves and cross-referencing the numbers in Liam's footnotes. He scribbled the words down on a legal pad, his handwriting growing sloppier with each new discovery. The random words began to form a coherent, terrifying narrative. They. Control. Narrative. Forbidden. Each word was a breadcrumb, leading him deeper into a darkness he couldn't have imagined existed within the hallowed halls of Yale. This wasn't the work of a student who had simply run away. This was the meticulous, desperate work of a whistleblower who knew he was in mortal danger. He was using his own academic research, the very tool of his passion, as a secret key to expose a hidden truth. By the time the first rays of dawn broke over the campus, Ben had deciphered the full message. The words on his legal pad formed a chilling plea from the past. Finch lies. They control the narrative. Look for the forbidden file under Folio 71. They found me. The final 3 words hit him like a physical blow. They found me. It was a death sentence, written 15 years ago. Ben leaned back in his chair, the stale coffee in his mug forgotten. Alistair Finch, the revered historian, the titan of his field, was at the center of this. The entire official story of Liam's disappearance, the troubled kid from Bridgeport, the pressure, the flight, was a carefully constructed lie, a lie designed to cover something far more sinister. Liam hadn't run away. He had been silenced. A wave of cold paranoia washed over him. He was sitting in the very office of the man Liam had accused. He looked around at the stacks of books, the academic awards on the wall, the entire legacy of a celebrated career. It all felt like a facade now. What was Folio 71, and who were they? He was holding a piece of evidence that could potentially unravel careers and shatter the university's pristine reputation. But it was just a series of words on a notepad, decoded from a dead man's footnotes. Going to the university would be a risk. They had already shown their willingness to bury the story once. Going to the police felt equally futile. They had bungled the investigation from the start. For the first time, Ben Carter understood the profound isolation Liam must have felt. He sat in the silence for a long time, the weight of his discovery pressing down on him. He could put the folder back in the filing cabinet, pretend he never found it, and continue with his promising career. It would be the safe thing to do, the rational choice. But he couldn't shake the image of Liam O'Connell, a brilliant 22-year-old, using the only weapon he had, his mind, to fight back against a powerful, unseen enemy. He had left this map for someone to find, a final, desperate act of faith that the truth would one day matter more than the narrative. In that moment, Ben Carter made a decision. He wasn't just a historian anymore. He was the custodian of Liam's last words. He had to find Folio 71. He owed it to the student who had been silenced for far too long. His first challenge was a practical one: how to find a file that was, by its very definition, hidden. Ben's mind raced through the university's labyrinthine archival system. Folio 71 inches sounded archaic, a designation from an older cataloging method. Armed with his faculty credentials, which granted him access to the university's most restricted collections, he spent the next day in the climate-controlled silence of the manuscript archives. He wasn't looking for an official record, but for a deliberate omission, a gap in the sequence. After hours of searching through dusty ledgers and forgotten accession logs, he found it. Tucked away on a high shelf in a low-traffic section was a simple gray archival box with a faded, handwritten label that read, Architectural Plans, Sterling Library Annex, 1950 to 1955. It was completely out of place, but the accession number stamped on its side ended in a faint, almost illegible 71. Back in the security of his locked office, Ben pried open the lid of the weathered box. The scent of old paper and something else, a faint, dry smell of leather, filled the air. Inside, nestled between brittle architectural blueprints, was not a file, but a small, worn, leather-bound journal and a thick stack of photocopied documents held together by a rusty binder clip. He carefully lifted the journal. The cover was embossed with a single, faded initial, L. His breath caught in his throat. This was it. This was Liam's voice, preserved in time. He ran his fingers over the cover, feeling an almost unbearable connection to the young man he had never met. The documents felt heavy, official, and profoundly out of place. He was no longer just a historian analyzing a text. He was an investigator who had just unearthed the victim's final testament. He opened the journal and began to read. The first few entries were filled with the academic excitement of a young scholar on the verge of a breakthrough, but the tone quickly shifted from discovery to suspicion, and then to outright fear. Liam wrote about uncovering a pattern in his research, historical records that seemed to vanish, sources that were deliberately miscatalogued, and a consistent, unwritten rule among senior faculty to avoid certain topics related to New England's most powerful families. He had given it a name, a label he'd found in an obscure text about ancient secret societies, the Cadmus Society. He described it as a cabal of Yale's most revered historians, led by his own advisor, Alistair Finch, who saw themselves not as scholars but as stewards of legacy, actively curating the past to protect the reputations of the university's wealthiest benefactors. The journal then detailed the specific discovery that sealed his fate. While researching the financing of 19th-century railroads, Liam had stumbled upon a reference to a violent miners' strike in Pennsylvania in 1892. The official histories barely mentioned it, but through painstaking work with microfilmed local newspapers, he uncovered the horrifying truth. The strike had been brutally crushed by a private militia, resulting in the deaths of over 24 workers, including women and children. The massacre had been systematically erased from state and national records. The man who owned the mine and railroad, the man who gave the order to fire on his own employees, was Harrington Finch, Drive Alistair Finch's great-grandfather. Liam hadn't just uncovered a historical footnote. He had found the bloody, rotten foundation of one of Yale's most prominent academic dynasties. The photocopied documents in the box were the irrefutable proof. They were internal corporate memos from the Finch Mining and Rail Company, payroll ledgers for the hired militia, and, most damningly, a copy of a telegram signed by Harrington Finch himself. It read, "Spare no expense. End this disruption by any means necessary. I will assume all liability." Liam had somehow found these documents in a private family archive he'd gained access to under false pretenses, and he had meticulously copied them. This was the evidence the Cadmus Society had spent a century burying. It was a conspiracy not just to protect a family's reputation, but to conceal a mass killing. The academic exercise had become a criminal investigation, and Liam, a 22-year-old student from Bridgeport, was the sole prosecutor. Liam's journal named the other members of the society. It wasn't just Finch. He had identified 2 others who were actively working to suppress his research: Dr. Marcus Thorne, the head of the history department at the time, and Dr. Julian Croft, a legendary and highly influential historian who had since passed away. These were men who had built their careers on the very idea of objective truth. They were intellectual giants, their names etched onto plaques and endowed chairs throughout the university. The revelation was staggering. The villains of this story weren't thugs from Liam's old neighborhood, as the police had presumed. They were the intellectual elite, the supposed guardians of history, who had perverted their life's work into a tool for a powerful, century-long cover-up. The final pages of the diary were sparse, the handwriting shaky. Liam described a tense meeting where Finch and Thorne had offered him a full scholarship to Oxford and a guaranteed professorship upon his return. All he had to do was abandon his thesis. "They didn't ask me to stop," he wrote. "They told me." He knew it was both a bribe and a threat. He refused. The very last entry, dated May 12, 1998, consisted of only 3 sentences. "They know I made copies," Finch called, "says he wants to show me something in the Beinecke archives that will change my perspective. Meeting him tonight." Ben Carter closed the journal, the silence of the office pressing in on him. It wasn't a confession, but it was the next best thing. It was a map leading directly to the moment Liam O'Connell walked into the library and never walked out. Ben Carter now faced a terrifying choice. He held the truth in a worn leather journal, but it was a truth protected by a fortress of academic power and institutional inertia. To approach the university or the police would be to risk having the evidence buried again, this time for good. He was one man against a century-old conspiracy. He realized that the only power strong enough to break through those stone walls was the power of public scrutiny. After a sleepless night, his hand shaking slightly, he picked up the phone and called the investigative desk at the *Boston Globe. He asked for Sarah Jennings, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist known for her tenacity and her refusal to be intimidated by powerful institutions. He introduced himself simply. "My name is Dr. Ben Carter. I'm a professor at Yale. I think I know what happened to Liam O'Connell." The meeting took place in a nondescript coffee shop halfway between New Haven and Boston, a neutral ground for a dangerous alliance. Sarah Jennings was sharp, skeptical, and listened with an intensity that missed no detail. Ben laid out the journal and the photocopied documents on the table between them. For 2 hours, she cross-examined him, testing every part of the story, looking for holes. But the evidence was meticulous, a chain of logic forged by Liam himself. As she read the final, chilling entry in his journal, her skepticism melted away, replaced by a cold, professional anger. She saw the story not just as a murder mystery, but as a profound betrayal of the public trust. Together, they spent the next 2 weeks secretly verifying every possible detail, preparing to detonate a story that would shake the academic world to its core. On a Sunday morning in late October 2013, the story broke. The headline on the front page of the *Boston Globe was stark and devastating. "Yale's darkest secret: Missing Student's Thesis Reveals Academic Cabal and 15-Year Cover-Up. The article was a bombshell. It laid out Liam's discovery, the coded message in his footnotes, the contents of his journal, and named Alistair Finch and Marcus Thorne as central figures. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Yale's administration issued a swift, forceful denial, condemning the story as a grievous and unsubstantiated attack on the integrity of our faculty. But it was too late. The narrative they had controlled for 15 years was shattered. News vans descended on the campus, and Liam O'Connell's smiling, youthful face was suddenly everywhere again, no longer a forgotten victim, but the hero of a story that demanded a final chapter. The public outcry was immense, forcing the hand of the very authorities who had once dismissed the case. Shamed into action by the national spotlight, the New Haven Police Department announced they were officially reopening the investigation into Liam O'Connell's disappearance, assigning a new team of seasoned homicide detectives. The pressure on the surviving members of the Cadmus Society became unbearable. Alistair Finch, now a celebrated emeritus professor living in a quiet retirement community, refused to comment. But the confident, authoritative figure was replaced by a haunted old man hounded by reporters. For Dr. Marcus Thorne, however, the story was a death knell. At 87, and in the final stages of pancreatic cancer, he saw the legacy he had so carefully curated crumbling to dust. The weight of the secret was now heavier than the disease ravaging his body. 3 days after the story was published, Marcus Thorne's lawyer contacted the lead detective. The old historian was ready to talk. In a formal deposition from his mahogany-paneled study, surrounded by the books that had defined his life, Thorne confessed everything. His voice, thin and raspy, recounted the events of May 12, 1998, with a chilling academic precision. He, Finch, and the late Julian Croft had summoned Liam to a secluded office in the Sterling Memorial Library Tower. They had intended to intimidate him, to impress upon him the gravity of his discovery and the wisdom of accepting their generous offer to study abroad. They saw it as protecting the institution, a necessary evil. They gravely underestimated the boy from Bridgeport. They underestimated his integrity. Liam had listened to their offer, a full ride to Oxford, a guaranteed professorship, a life of prestige, and he had calmly refused. He told them the truth was more important than his career. He said he owed it to the people whose stories had been erased. According to Thorne, it was Finch who lost control. Enraged by the young man's defiance, by this working-class upstart challenging a century of curated history, Finch grabbed a heavy bronze bookend from the desk and struck Liam across the head. There was no struggle, no prolonged fight, just a single panicked act of violence. Liam O'Connell, the brilliant, promising scholar, fell to the floor and was gone. The silence that followed, Thorne recalled, was the most terrifying sound he had ever heard. The guardians of history had just committed the ultimate act of erasure. Thorne's confession ended with the final, gruesome detail that had eluded everyone for 15 years. In the hours that followed the murder, the 3 distinguished professors became common criminals. Under the cover of darkness, they wrapped Liam's body in an old canvas tarp from a storage closet. They used Finch's car to drive him to the far side of campus, to the sprawling construction site of what would become the new Becton Center for Engineering. The foundation had been poured that very week. With shovels taken from the site, they dug a shallow grave in the still-curing concrete of a sub-basement support column. They buried Liam O'Connell there, entombing him forever within the very institution he had given his life to. Thorne provided the detectives with the original blueprints, circling the exact location. The long search was finally over. Liam was coming home. The excavation began under the cold, fluorescent lights of the Becton Center's sub-basement, a place usually humming with the sound of servers and engineering equipment. Now, the air was thick with concrete dust and the percussive roar of jackhammers. It was a grim, surgical operation, guided by the faded blueprints provided by a dying man. For hours, workers chipped away at the reinforced column, a pillar that had supported a temple of science for 15 years while concealing a horrific secret. Then, A hush fell over the site. The work stopped. Wrapped in the rotted remains of a canvas tarp, they had found him. Liam O'Connell, the boy who had vanished into thin air, had been there all along, entombed in the very foundations of the institution he had so admired. The search was over, but the final, painful chapter was just beginning. The arrest of Dr. Alistair Finch was a quiet, surreal affair. 2 detectives arrived at his upscale retirement community, finding him reading in a sunlit room filled with books and accolades from a lifetime of celebrated scholarship. He showed no surprise, no outrage, only a profound, weary resignation. The image of the frail, 82-year-old man in a cashmere sweater being led away in handcuffs was a jarring spectacle that played on a loop on national news. His ivory tower, built on a foundation of lies, had crumbled in an instant. Yale University, forced into a corner, issued a carefully worded statement expressing, quote, deep sorrow and shock, vowing full cooperation. But the damage was done. The institution that had once dismissed a mother's pleas was now at the center of a murder scandal that exposed a rot deep within its hallowed halls. For Sharon O'Connell, the official notification came in a phone call from the lead detective. He spoke in gentle, measured tones, but the words, "We've found him," landed with the force of a physical blow. It was the moment she had both prayed for and dreaded for 15 years. There was no screaming, no collapse, only a long, shuddering exhale that seemed to release a decade and a half of tension from her body. The torturous phantom of hope was finally exorcised, replaced by the crushing, solid weight of grief. The ambiguous loss that had defined her existence was over. She could no longer search for a ghost. She could finally plan a funeral. For the first time since 1998, she knew where her son was. He was coming home, and she could finally, truly mourn him. The news did not bring solace to Liam's father. For Mike O'Connell, the brutal finality of the truth was a blow from which he would never recover. The uncertainty had been a poison, but it had also been a strange, thin shield against the absolute worst-case scenario. The alcohol had numbed the not knowing. Now, faced with the concrete, horrific image of his son's fate, murdered by a professor, buried in concrete, the shield shattered completely. He retreated further into himself, the silence in their small house growing heavier than ever before. The story of his son, the brilliant Yale scholar, had found its ending, but for Mike, there was no closure, only the confirmation of a nightmare that had been playing out in the dark corners of his mind for 15 agonizing years. Justice for Liam did not heal the wounds that had been left to fester for so long. The trial of Alistair Finch was a national spectacle, a courtroom drama that pitted academic prestige against a working-class family's quest for truth. Finch, arrogant and defiant to the end, pleaded not guilty, his defense attempting to paint Liam as an unstable, obsessive student. But the evidence was overwhelming. Liam's meticulously coded thesis, his chilling journal entries, and most damningly, the videotaped deposition of a dying Marcus Thorne, all pointed to one man. The jury took less than 4 hours to reach a verdict. As the word guilty echoed through the courtroom, a quiet sob broke from Sharon O'Connell. Alistair Finch was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, condemned to spend his final years stripped of his legacy, remembered not as a great historian, but as a killer who silenced a student to protect a lie. In the aftermath, Yale was forced into a period of painful and public reckoning. The Cadmus Society was exposed and dismantled, and the university established a new, independent ethics board to oversee academic research. But the most enduring legacy came in the form of a tribute. Funded by an anonymous donor, the university created the Liam O'Connell Grant for Historical Integrity, a prestigious scholarship awarded each year to a promising student from an underprivileged background, dedicated to uncovering forgotten truths. Liam's name, once a whispered ghost story used to scare freshmen, was now etched in stone at the entrance to the history department. He was no longer a victim of the institution, but its conscience, a permanent reminder that no narrative is safe from the student who is brave enough to keep digging for the truth. Liam O'Connell was finally laid to rest in a small cemetery in Bridgeport, under an oak tree that overlooked the city he'd fought so hard to transcend. The funeral was not a media event. It was a quiet, somber gathering of family and friends, the people who remembered him not as a headline, but as the quiet boy who loved books and dreamed of changing the world. For Sharon O'Connell, it was the end of a 15-year vigil. As the first handful of dirt was tossed onto the casket, a sense of profound, heartbreaking finality settled over her. It was not peace, not yet, but it was closure. The long, agonizing question of where had finally been answered. Her son was no longer a ghost haunting the halls of an indifferent institution. He was home, and the world finally knew his name and the truth for which he died. The scandal left an indelible scar on the soul of Yale University. The name Liam O'Connell, once a piece of forgotten folklore, is now permanently etched into the institution's conscience. The Liam O'Connell Grant for Historical Integrity has become one of the university's most prestigious awards, a symbol of its forced reckoning with its own past. His thesis, once buried, is now required reading in freshman ethics seminars, a case study in the corrupting influence of power and the moral courage required to confront it. The story serves as a constant, humbling reminder to every student and professor who walks those hallowed grounds that the pursuit of knowledge carries a profound responsibility, and that the greatest threat to truth can sometimes come from within the very walls built to protect it. His legacy is not one of tragedy, but of transformation. Ultimately, Liam O'Connell's story is a powerful testament to the fact that history is not a static collection of facts, but an active, ongoing battle for the truth. It demonstrates how narratives, especially those of the powerful, are constructed, protected, and, if necessary, defended with violence. But it also shows that no lie, no matter how carefully constructed or how long it is maintained, is permanent. It took the meticulous work of a student, the accidental curiosity of a professor, and the unwavering tenacity of a journalist to dismantle a conspiracy that had stood for a century. It is a sobering reminder that the first draft of history is often written by the victors, but the final, true account belongs to those who are brave enough to keep digging, no matter the cost. Today, Sharon O'Connell is no longer just a grieving mother. She has become a tireless advocate, founding a small nonprofit that helps working-class families navigate the often indifferent systems of law enforcement and academia when a loved one goes missing. She uses her son's story to give a voice to others who have been silenced. Dr. Ben Carter remains a professor at Yale, but he teaches history with a weight and a purpose he never had before, forever mindful that behind every historical record is a human story. As for Alistair Finch, he died in a state prison hospital 7 years into his life sentence, his name stripped from every academic journal and university plaque. A final, ironic erasure for a man who spent his life curating the past. His legacy, once so celebrated, was reduced to a cautionary tale. The truth, in the end, did not bring Liam O'Connell back. It did not heal the shattered heart of his father, or erase 15 years of a mother's agony. But it did provide something just as vital. It provided justice. It affirmed that his life, and the principles for which he stood, mattered more than the powerful secrets of men who believed they were above reproach. His story is a solemn reminder that no victim should ever be forgotten, and that the search for truth, no matter how long it takes, is a fundamental act of human dignity. If you believe that every story deserves to be told, please consider sharing this one. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep investigations into the cases that demand our attention. Thank you for listening.